next technique is Crayon Resist. For this technique, in this basket of tools that I showed you earlier, you'll find some old pieces of just clear wax candles, and that you can use that. And I also grabbed a crayon. I'll show you a little bit of both. So I'm going to color kind of hard and thick with my candle in this section, and then I'll also do a little coloring with my crayon. And many of you, if you went to elementary school here in Cary, you did Crayon Resist in art classes. So I'll show you that so you would know how this works. So for this technique, you can simply just paint over the top of these. But if you want to get fancy, you could go in and paint other colors too. Might come and lift a little bit of my paint off there. So you can see how the paint doesn't stick as well to the waxy part. It is important that you use a lot of pressure and get a lot of wax down on the paper when you're doing it so you can see it. And I can come and do my little technique of pulling paint off if it covers it too much. Okay. So that is the wax resist. Okay. And if I wanted to, I could play around and have a little fun with this one. And I could add a little bit of dark coloring in there, just to give it a little more volume. But you don't need to do that. You can just do that, the technique that I was showing you, just so you know how it works. Different ways of doing different things. Okay, the next technique is the masking tape resist, and for this one, I'm going to just put some masking tape down on my paper. You could always paint a section, let it dry, and then put the tape down, and that would just protect the area, the color that you already had there, from receiving paint. So I've taped that down, and now I'm going to just paint over it. I need to let this dry before I peel the tape off. My paint in this section is completely dry, so now I can carefully peel away the masking tape, and I will have a clean, bare section where I didn't paint. So if you painted a color, then applied masking tape, and then painted over the top of it, what your original color would be underneath there, or you could just have white. So that's a method that you can use to protect and cover up and have layers. Now the next technique is masking fluid or rubber cement resist. I'm going to do it two different ways for you today. So one, I'm going to paint a section of paint and let it dry, and then I'll apply the resist to the dry paint, and I'm also going to apply the resist to my white paper. So there's two different ways. This masket, the one that I have right now, looks like this, and there's a couple of tools that you can use to apply it. You don't want to really use a paintbrush, because if you can see, it gets gummy and it will ruin the paintbrush right away. And you take the lid off of this, and you can see it's kind of just a liquid in there, and I think it always doesn't hurt to read the directions to see if you need to shake it or what you need to do. So it's important that before you use it, you dip these nibs into water and then blot them. So I'm going to do that. And blot it is just, dabbing it on your paper towel so that it's not too wet and runny. But that's going to help it not stick to that nib so much. Then I'll put some on my nib, and I'm going to just draw a few lines here. I can really get a fine line if I want, depending on how much I apply. And I don't know if you can see, but as I'm doing this, I'm going to slide this over a little bit. I can see there's a little sheen, and I can see where I've applied this. So now I have to let it dry completely, 100% dry, before I'm done. And as soon as you're done applying this liquid Frisket, rinse off your nib, okay, and dry it completely so that we don't end up with it all stuck to the end of the nib. You can use both ends and you'll get a much bigger coverage with this side, but don't forget, wet it, and then if you're doing a big area, keep wetting it and blotting it as you use it periodically. Get it wet. Okay, so now we're going to let that section dry, and then I'll come back and show you what happens when you paint over the top. Okay, so my watercolor, or my liquid masket or liquid Frisket, it's called both things, is pretty dry where I've applied it, so I'm just going to paint over the top of it with a color that I have handy in my brush. And this one is still a little tacky to the touch, and I'd probably give it a little bit more time to dry, so I'll just paint over at the top half for a minute. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and paint over the top part of this yellow section that I did with my red, and so you can see what will happen. So this is kind of like that glazing technique I was showing you before. We'll do the whole thing because I did apply this after I turned it red. Okay, so I'm going to wait a few minutes to let this completely dry, and then we'll remove the liquid Frisket. Now my paint is dry, so now I can come along and remove that liquid Frisket. So you can just take your finger and rub it away, but one other way that works pretty well is to take an eraser. So if I take an eraser like this, if you don't have one like this, your finger works pretty good, or one of your other kinds of erasers will work pretty well too. And now this is where I had yellow paint and covered that up. So you can see here I just did it on white paper, and then down here I painted a layer of yellow and then painted over the top, and I protected that color that was under. So this next technique is to use plastic wrap, and for one, the second half of it talks about painting a section and then leaving the plastic wrap on there until it dries. So I'm going to go ahead and do half of it like that and place my plastic wrap on, and then we'll take it off when it's dry. Okay. Then the next part of it is you crumple plastic wrap, put it in your paint, and paint with it. I can get a different color and paint with it. Here's my watercolor section. I just removed the plastic wrap from where it dried, and you can see we have a really cool texture there. So those are two different ways to use plastic wrap. Next section is splatter, and if you've noticed, I have really protected my work with paper towels, and you want to be really careful not to get too carried away with this or you get too wet with it, because you'll end up splattering your neighbor, yourself, your clothes, and we don't want to do that. But splattering is a really nice technique for painting. So with this one, you'll use a stiff bristle brush, load it with thickened pigment, and either strike it across your finger or flip it with your thumb. Make sure the brush is near the surface of the paper but not touching. So when I do this, I'll actually load up my brush, and I'm using a toothbrush because it works really great. And I'm going to get a little pigment with it. Okay, and we'll see if we have enough here. And then I can use my paintbrush to do the flicking. So hope you can see I'm getting some splatters there. If you want bigger splatters, then you're going to have to get your paintbrush your toothbrush a little bit wet, and then blot it because you don't want it to be too wet, and then splatter, and then you'll get bigger splatters. See that? It's kind of fun to do multiple colors. Now you can't really see that I've changed colors here. So I'm going to rinse my brush out a little better, blot it dry. I'm blotting it dry. Now I'm going to get some more paint and do multiple colors. So go ahead and try that with 2 or 3 colors, and that's splatter paint. Okay, so now that I'm completely done with all my techniques, I need you to remove the tape. So when you're done with yours, you're going to go back and remove the masking tape. One of the easiest ways to do this is to take your masking tape and pull it off slowly at an angle. And that will help your paper to keep from tearing. If you pull it back like this straight, then a lot of times you'll end up tearing your paper. So do it at an angle, and then you need to go back in and layer every layer. Sorry, excuse me. You need to go back in and label your different techniques on the squares. Okay, so I'll pull all those off and then I'll show you how to cut the paper off the board. Caution to be really careful and pull your tape off slowly. I was kind of hurrying through this trying to get done, and I ripped back part of my painting, and so you want to be really careful and take it slow and steady, because it would be really sad if you had masking tape on a finished piece and you ripped it off and ruined it. And the techniques, it's not as sad, but it sure mars the finished product. So be very careful, take your time, and be careful removing the masking. So one of the last things that you're going to do now that you're done with these techniques is we've got to cut this brown paper off the board. And one thing that you don't want to do is cut too deeply so that you mar the board underneath. So what I do is I take my finger and try to fill where the edge of the paper is, and I kind of crease that with my fingernail. And then I'll take my X-Acto knife and pull it towards me, and I'm just cutting just enough to where I can see that the paper will lift, and I can do that. If you're uncomfortable using an X-Acto knife, please let me know and I will help you do it. The important thing to remember is with knife safety, with everything, is make sure your other hands are out of the way, make sure there's nobody around you, and do it slowly and carefully so that you don't have an accident and hurt anybody, and keep your other hand well away from the blade. Okay. When you're done cutting this apart, you need to remove the excess tape from the board. The way you're going to do that is, let's see if I got this all off. The brown paper first, the brown paper that's around the edge of the board can just stay. It doesn't need to be removed, and then you need to make sure you label every square so that you know what it's supposed to be, what technique it is, and I know when I'm grading it. And then lastly, you're going to go ahead and remove with your hand as much of this tape as you can, and then you'll take it to the sink and use a sponge and wet it down. And all you need to do is just wet the tape. You don't need to wet the whole board. But you first of all peel off as much as you can, and then once you've wet it down and let it soak and sit for a little while, you can use a paint scraper to scrape the excess paint off. And then when you're completely done with that, be sure that you get all the extra sticky residue off the board, and then let the board dry and put it away. And then you'll be ready to start the next step of this project. The process for removing the tape from the board that your painting was adhered to. So you're going to get it wet, use a scraper to scrape it away, and then lastly use a sponge to remove all of the sticky residue.